I feel like just a few years ago, I lived a completely different life. I lived in a city, paid rent, was self-employed, and worked my dream job at ELLE magazine. In terms of having a career in fashion media, this was pretty much the pinnacle of what you could achieve in my country. So why was I deeply unhappy? And why was I completely burned out? It's been 3 years since I realized my dream has turned into a nightmare and finally decided to quit the magazine I loved and adored. Now I'm ready to share the full story for the first time, revealing the reality of fashion publishing at the biggest fashion magazine in the world and what made me finally walk away from a job so many would kill for. Welcome to my slow-paced life, one that I chose instead of chasing titles, status, and money. Okay, so before going into the nitty-gritty of what happened with my dream job, I want to give you a little bit of like the background, the history of how this became my dream job so that you better understand like the scale of everything. So basically, I think my first like spark when I started like following and being interested in fashion was in the late 90s when the movie Clueless came out. And yeah, I was just so in love with the costumes there that I started making my own clothes and yeah, started being interested into fashion magazines and things like that. And I was actually going to high school for design and photography, but my major was art, not anything to do with fashion. And then after finishing high school, I don't know, I was a bit lost. Like I didn't really know where to go, what to study. I think my love for fashion kind of like was in the background, or I just kind of like forgot about it. And I was just doing different studies, nothing really stick. Then the 2008 recession and the financial crisis came, and it was so hard to do anything as a young person. And you know, you're like in your 20s then, early 20s, and you just feel kind of clueless about everything. And yeah, I had no idea what I want to do until it got so bad. I had this like nervous breakdown kind of moment where I was just like, okay, I need to rethink my whole strategy here and find a path. And I went back to like, okay, what do I actually want to do? Like, what am I like super interested in? And yeah, the topic of fashion like was coming up a lot. But you know, the fashion industry is a broad industry. You can do so many different things. And I kind of realized that, yeah, I loved writing. I was a writer since always. I was writing essays, poetry, journals, you name it. Like I was expressing myself through writing. So I was like, oh my God, fashion writing. I would love to work for a magazine. And then in 2005, I remember ELLE started being issued in Slovenia. And I think since the very beginning, I was buying it and reading it. It was like that quote where Sarah Jessica Parker, where her character Carrie says in Sex and the City that, you know, she was broke, but she was rather buying Vogue than food because that fed her more. I felt the same. Like I was really struggling to keep any kind of work and get income coming, but I know that those few euros that I had, I would always go for fashion magazines. And so this is kind of like where everything then really started. I was sending my applications and cold emailing pretty much any editor in Slovenia at any kind of magazine that had even like a tiniest article about fashion. And very soon I actually got my first journalist position, and I was writing for a fashion, not column, like a page, fashion page. And slowly, so my dream was always to work at ELLE, but you have to know Slovenia is a very small market. The editorial staff of ELLE at that time was maybe like 7, 8, definitely less than 10 people. So to get a job in a place where there's 10 people, and also like those positions are pretty highly ranked, like I cannot just start working as an editor, you know, I have to start as like an assistant. So basically it took me 7 years from when I decided I want to work at ELLE, this is my dream job, one day I'm gonna work at ELLE, to actually getting the call and they're calling me to have an interview, which I didn't know it was a job interview at that time. But a lot has happened in between, and yeah, fashion is really not an easy market to break into, especially in small markets, and especially this is pre-social media era. There was no YouTube tutorials, no Instagram pages with career advice. There was so much gatekeeping going on. I was so clueless about what I was doing. I literally had to learn on my mistakes, and I had to kind of like carve out my own opportunities. So a lot of the times I would be the person like organizing fashion shoots and just gathering my friends and getting like my clothes and like starting to collaborate with different designers and things like that. Anyway, there's so much that happened in those 7 years, but yeah, at the end I got the call and they offered me the assistant to chief editor position.
I started working at ELLE on my 30th birthday. So that was pretty much the best present I have ever received. Hard work has paid off. I got my dream job. I started working there as the assistant of editor-in-chief. But as the editorial staff of ELLE in Slovenia is very small, we all had many other roles. I was also a journalist, a fashion stylist, and the photo editor. My paycheck was pretty average for an entry position and sufficient for a young person living in the city at that time. I didn't complain. However, this position came with an expiration date. I was substituting a maternity leave. Still, I was determined to make the most out of it, and who knows? So after 1 year, when I was mentally preparing to say goodbye to the best thing that ever happened to me, I got an even bigger surprise. They were so impressed with my work ethic, they decided to keep me. To say I was thrilled is such an understatement. I felt like I made it. I was now a permanent ELLE staff member, and the sky was the limit. But as inspiring as that sounds, it's also very unrealistic. My first year at ELLE, I felt unstoppable, on top of the world, the luckiest, happiest person alive. Nothing else mattered, and there was no reason for me to feel depressed. But after a while, that feeling of novelty, excitement, and motivation wears off, and when it does, it's much easier to notice the cracks. I'm sure most of you have at least heard of the cultural phenomena, the movie called The Devil Wears Prada. It's a portrayal of how the fashion magazine world operates and what it takes for you to succeed in it. What most people see is the ultra-glamorous photos and events, but behind the scenes, it's a ruthless machine that will crush anyone who shows any kind of weakness. There's little room for error, and literally no room for any kind of personal struggle. You're so easily replaceable, you blink at the wrong time and you're out. And the leadership not only knows this, they will remind you of it at any chance they get. For someone who's incredibly sensitive and has a history of anxiety and depression, this was a ticking time bomb. What you see in the movies isn't at all that exaggerated. It's just as vain, toxic, and heartless as Miranda Priestly makes it to be. But as a young creative craving your path in this world, you can be very blind to all this. I certainly was. There were no boundaries. I would sometimes be folding clothes, doing inventory after a 15-hour photo shoot at midnight on a Saturday with no one else in the building. I was delusionally tired, with no one to give me a hand. I would often write articles about depression, mentioning my personal struggles, yet no one in 9 years working there asked me how I'm feeling, if I need a day off, or anything any normal, compassionate human being would do. I can't even count the amount of times I was made feel like I don't matter, like I don't belong, like I'm not enough. Of course, showing any of that would be the biggest faux pas. So I suffered in silence. But if all that wasn't bad enough, I might have even been willing to eat it all up if I was at least compensated fairly. But that was very far from reality. As I mentioned, I was self-employed, even though legally the company should have employed me. But okay, let's leave that. My paycheck stayed the same for the first couple of years, but the self-employment taxes and social security payments in Slovenia, they rise with every year that you're self-employed. So I was technically actually earning less every year, but my responsibilities were constantly rising. As I was paid a flat monthly rate, by contract, they could demand from me to do all kinds of tasks that weren't actually in my job jurisdiction, and many times they took that opportunity. But the real shit hit the fan when COVID hit. Since everything was closed and they couldn't really sell magazines, my paycheck was suddenly cut in half. With paying all the self-employment contributions, I was left with less than what was my rent at the time. I couldn't afford to live in my apartment anymore. I couldn't afford to live anywhere in the city anymore. I was left with two choices. Either I move back with my parents, or I find an alternative option of living somewhere where I don't have to pay rent. I opted for the second one and moved into a community in Tenerife, where I volunteered in an animal sanctuary in exchange for accommodation and food. In retrospect, that was actually the experience that completely changed the trajectory of my life and made me see that there's actually other alternative options out there. But that wasn't the end of my journey. It actually gets worse, much worse. Not being able to cover even the basic living expenses, I was desperate to earn more money, and in doing so, I accepted a few very lousy offers. The publishing company that issues ELLE offered me to work on some other magazines in addition to my position at ELLE, which at the time was already executive editor. First, I became the fashion editor of a magazine called Story, and then also the fashion editor at Cosmopolitan. I was suddenly an editor at 3 different magazines for the same paycheck I got 4 or 5 years ago as the assistant. That means 3 times the amount of work, 3 times the amount of deadlines and people to answer to. At first, I just dealt with it. I mean, as a journalist in my country, I had very little options for any kind of work, so I was happy at least to get some kind of income. The good thing about COVID was that now I was working remotely for most of the time. But at the time, I was living in London on a salary of a self-employed journalist/editor from Slovenia, and that was far from what rom-coms and popular TV series make you believe. So I took on even more work for some extra euros, which, when turned into pounds and compared to the local average, were literally pennies. It's around that time that my mental health situation took a turn for the worst. I lived in a city where it seems like everyone is living on 100K per year, and I could barely earn a 10K. Whenever I tried to raise the question of my income with my managers, they quickly reminded me of two things: how there's at least 10 girls waiting to take my job, and how they're making me a huge favor by letting me work remote. I should be so happy and just keep quiet. And apparently, I had all these other benefits too. No, not social security, not health insurance, no paid sick leave or vacation days. What I had were free restaurant meals and hotel stays when I was reviewing them for articles, which was a couple of times per year. So that should be enough, no? Why am I even complaining? I'm literally on vacation all the time, enjoying all these luxuries. When the reality was, I was working and all these freebies always came with strings attached, deadlines, meetings, and so on. And since I could never afford these places on my own, I would often find myself in the craziest, fanciest hotels eating instant noodles I brought with me. It was actually pretty funny. I felt so out of place. The magazine wanting me to write about things I could never afford on my own. It was all an illusion. It was all a lie. And it took me a very, very long time to realize I'm not the same person anymore who dreamt of working at ELLE. I changed. My values have changed. My priorities have changed. Over time, I stopped caring about fashion and started to care more about my well-being, my health, my creativity. There was a time I thought I could change the world by writing at such a magazine. After many years of trying, I realized the bosses don't care about changing the world. They only care about money. I meant nothing to them. The values the magazine held meant nothing to them. Making a difference meant nothing to them. Now, don't get me wrong. There were many incredible people there. Many taught me a lot, not just about publishing, but also about relationships, creativity, journalism, beauty, and life itself. Some were really passionate, really determined to create good work, but to the leadership, nothing else mattered than numbers. So over the years, I'd seen many of these brilliant people throw their gun into the corn, as we say in Slovenia. Most went out completely burned out and disappointed, me included. So what drew the last straw? This time it wasn't as dramatic as having a nervous breakdown, but the weight of everything over time just became too heavy to carry. I already started dreaming of a life far away from the city, far away from deadlines and constant pressure, while I was still working at ELLE and the two other magazines. I decided to move to the mountains and, for the season, work in a hotel as a receptionist. I thought it would be a great way to earn some money quick, and then I can free myself from lousy contracts and invest into my future. While I was enjoying the fresh air and spectacular views of high mountain peaks, working nonstop without any days off, I finally cemented my burnout deep into my being. I had to finally admit defeat and make a drastic change. I gave my publishing bosses an ultimatum, which they didn't agree on. And I mean, I knew they wouldn't because it was literally crazy. But it was worth a shot since at this point I had nothing to lose. The parting was very bad. They didn't want to pay what I've earned, and I literally had to fight for 500 euros with them. And at the end, they couldn't even say, Thank you for the 9 years with us. I mean, like, this alone tells me I would never ever want to work with these kind of people. There's no money in the world. After my seasonal job in the hotel finished, I took a very long break to heal my burnout. I did take another job in media publishing after that, which made me even more burned out, but at least they paid me a little bit more fairly. After just 4 months with this other company, I knew I want to walk away from the media publishing world forever. As there was no value in this job, I was just a content producing machine. There was no creativity, no passion, no real substance, again, just numbers. I sucked it up for a few more months until they found a replacement, and then in January 25, I quit my career after 17 years of non-stop hustle. Since then, there hasn't been a single day I would regret that decision. I finally healed myself. I got the space and time to do projects I feel passionate about, and I have no one controlling and manipulating me. I finally am free. Of course, a lot of beautiful things happened in that time too. I have amazing memories. I learned so much. The projects that I got to work on, some of them were just incredible. The places that I've seen and the people I've met. But the exploitative nature of the industry itself, that is what I could no longer bear. That's why when I started my fashion mentorship, I gave myself one clear task: to help fashion creatives build sustainable careers in this industry. And not just that, I'm teaching them how to change the industry from the inside, how to make it healthier, kinder, more human. In case you want to check my mentorship, I will link everything down in the description. There is a lot of beauty in the fashion world, but none of it matters if it costs you your health, identity, and respect. No job title is worth your integrity. I will always choose unemployment over a toxic work environment and health over any paycheck. It's up to you what matters to you most. I hope this video inspired you to walk your own path, trust your heart, and make decisions that support your long-term well-being. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.